Dr. Hardin is a professor of history at McMurry University in Abilene, Texas. He is the author of numerous award-winning books on Texas history and more than a dozen scholarly articles enjoyed by readers on both sides of the Atlantic. Texan Iliad, published in 1994, achieved distinction as a basic Texas book when bibliophile Mike Cox included it in more basic Texas books. It's also a book that's been on my shelf since it was published. It's an amazing book. When not engaged in the classroom, he serves as an on-air commentator, appearing on such varied venues as the A&E Network, the History Channel, and NBC's Today Show. Most recently, he appeared on the Fox News series Legends and Lies. Please join me providing a warm welcome to Dr. Stephen L. Hardin.
Thank you, my friend. Well, David, thank you for that warm and generous introduction. And thank all you folks for coming out on such a yucky day. I'm always suspicious of people who begin their talks with an apology, but I find myself in that category. I am not going to stand to address you today, and I certainly mean no disrespect. You probably, haven't noticed this, but I'm old. Last January, I turned 70, and nowadays, my check engine light is on pretty much all the time. And added to that, on Wednesday, I came down with a bout of sciatica. And if you don't know what sciatica is, good, you don't want to know. But it is a little painful. But that's okay. Because pain is part of what makes us human. It's part of the human condition. And I talk about the human condition a lot in my classes. And my 19-year-old jailheads are saying, well, Dr. Hardin, what is the human condition? And I said, it's pain, sorrow, loss, and grief. Pain, sorrow, loss, and grief. And my 19-year-old jailheads go, well, Dr. Hardin, that's often pessimistic of you. Isn't it also love and excitement and pleasure? And I said, sure, it's all that. But hell, that's easy. That's not a trouble. I mean, that doesn't challenge you. What challenges you? Well, pain, sorrow, loss, grief. And that's why it is so vital, just so vital, that our young people study history. Because every person who ever lived, every single one of them, experienced pain, sorrow, loss, and grief. And if we study history, if we study the lives of these people, when it happens to us, and if you live long enough, it will, you might know how to act. You might have a model. And we Texans certainly have a tremendous model of this in the Runaway Scrape. Well, let me tell you about it. It had rained for weeks. Even old-timers could not recall such a deluge. Creeks became rivers, rivers swelled into torrents. Downpours reduced unpaved roads, really more than cattle trails, into meandering troughs of muck. Yet thousands had taken to those boggy traces, the churning of wagon wheels and slogging of shoe leather whipped mud into a feculent paste. It encrusted their feet, making them stumble like drunkards. In their misery, some in fact took to the bottle and staggered with a dissipated authenticity. It was deep, that mud, the kind that sucked off shoes, bogged oxen, and smothered spirits. All kinds of people hastened from snug homes for the rain-lashed paths. Here, pallid clerks tottered beside bronzed backwoodsmen. There trudged somber farmers and raffish adventurers. Yonder, harried matrons shepherded squalling urchins. And above it all, astride a blooded stallion, the figure of an eccentric middle-aged general supporting mutton chop whiskers and a threadbare black cloth dress coat. Inscrutable, boasting a Yankee Doodle tricorn and straining to corral an amateur army comprised of far too many beardless volunteers. It was a relocation, a passage, and a war. Refugees fled before a tyrant who had vowed to rid Texas of these damned foreigners, to show no mercy, to offer no quarter. And his prior actions had proven him to be a man of his word. Hell-bent on reaching the borderline, runaways subjected their families to the dangers of the road and exposure to the elements. Once across the Sabine, they prayed for safety on U.S. soil. It was also unseasonably chilly. Well into late March and early April, winter maintained its icy grip. Buckshot winds roared along footpaths and bottoms. They set trees to rustling and tavern sides to squeaking. Evacuees hunched against the weather, trying to shrink stiffening bodies inside frozen clothing. Above the storm clouds, Texas stars may have been big and bright, but below, nights were as black as crow's wings. Still, frenzied runaways dared not halt and hobbled on through the gloom. They might have endured a soaking and even abided the frigid temperatures, but the combination spawned an array of fluxes, fevers, and flus that carried away hundreds of them. Yielding to the shivering wet, they collapsed along the roadside, dying miserably in the viscid mud, too weak to move from exhaustion, hypothermia, or disease. Texians, as the Anglo-American colonists then styled themselves, later recalled their trudge to the Louisiana border as the Great Runaway, the Sabine Chute, or most commonly, the Runaway Scrape. Whatever they called it, the wild flight during the sodden spring of 1836 was a nightmare of sorrow and suffering for every soul involved. This ordeal caused cataclysmic destruction, wholesale dislocation, and acute misery. It branded them and Texas forever. For its settlers, northeastern Mexico had always been a difficult, often hazardous place to live. But this mass departure added turmoil, hunger, illness, and collapses in communications, transportation, and law enforcement. Nowadays, most folks, well, even us Texans, have forgotten those intrepid evacuees, their anguish, and their exultations. Today, I hope to at least partially correct that lapse of collective memory. From this distance, it's hard to reconstruct the event in broad sweeps because none of the runaways ever saw it in its entirety. For the people who lived it, this surge of human misery was intensely subjective. What lingered in memory were random bits and snatches viewed through a veil of tears, grief, and intense emotion, unexpected dents of sound, spectacle, or stench, notable for their distinctiveness. Mere glimpses. In sources that survive, diaries, dispatches, letters, government documents, period newspapers, and reminiscences, the predominant feeling is one of dislodgement, anxiety, and fatigue. Yet there also appears the realization that they had experienced something historic, a satisfaction that they had prevailed, and a deep-rooted pride in their resilience. It is the story of what they saw on those roads, what they suffered, and what befell them during what was for most of them the most harrowing period of their lives. The Runaway Scrape flung people together who under normal circumstances would have never heard of each other and never met. While many of their stories are tragic, taken as a whole, the experience was not a tragedy. Indeed, years later, looking back on the event, their survivors regarded it as their finest hour. They tended to stress the courage, cooperation, and sense of community, because most, but not all, of the evacuees of 1836 did what Americans historically did in times of natural and man-made disasters. They stepped up, pitched in, and lent a hand. And it was all those helping hands and willing spirits in which the old Texians took so much pride. And so can we. They were a disparate lot. The painfully proper New York Episcopalian, many would have called her pompous, Mary Sherwood Reitman, would have had little in common with Susanna Dickinson, an illiterate backwoods widow. Anne Rainey Thomas, a 26-year-old native of Great Britain, would have had little to say to Uncle Jeff Parsons, an enslaved black man from the coastal bend. General Sam Houston, the Sword of San Jacinto, may have been hard-pressed to recall John Hollins Jenkins, who served under him as a 13-year-old private. 10-year-old Delia Rose would not known what to have said to Harriet Page, a mother of two who, after her ne'er-do-well husband abandoned her, had accepted the protection of the notorious maimer Robert Potter. The individuals who endured the great runaway were as varied an assortment of characters as ever shod shoe leather. From the good Samaritans to the ruthless rascals, yet chains of fellowship forged in the fires of adversity bound them all. The shared experience also created a cultural solidarity and singularity that remains to this day. One that mystifies and frankly, frequently annoys those from other states. In the years that followed, the words, "I was in the runaway scrape," earned the speaker a status that the Johnny-come-latelys who migrated to Texas afterwards never knew. A common misperception holds that the runaway scrape did not begin until news of the Alamo's fall reached Texan settlements. Yet, in the region between the Nueces and San Antonio rivers, it was in full swing weeks before. On Thursday, February 18th, 1836, General Jose Urrea, a vigorous and capable commander, began his campaign. His division departed Matamoros and crossed to the north bank of the Rio Bravo. His orders demanded that he seize control of the coastal ports by taking rebel strongholds at Goliad, Victoria, and ultimately Brazoria. His first objective was the sleepy village of San Patricio de Hibernia. The Irish colonists of San Patricio knew that their protestations of neutrality would not protect them from the war's desolation. The best policy, many concluded, was to vacate their homes and seek the safety of more secure locations. San Patricians made hasty preparations, hoping to conceal livestock from ravenous soldiers. They drove their herds deep into the countryside. Next, they packed offspring, blankets, silverware, and furniture into a motley assortment of wagons and carts. Families loaded as much as they could conveniently carry, hoping to return to their homes when all the mayhem subsided. Most drove their teams northward toward the Refugio and Goliad settlements. Some even traveled south, seeking refuge with friends in Matamoros. To Texans, this would have seemed counterintuitive. Why seek refuge in enemy territory? Yet these Irish settlers would have told them they had no reason to consider Mexicans to be the enemy. Besides, they might have explained, with more than a tinge of sourness, they weren't going into Mexico, they were going out of a bloody combat zone. North of San Patricio lay another Irish colony, one remarkably dissimilar in its attitudes and allegiances. Unlike the San Patricians, the Refugio Irish supported the Federalist cause. Local leaders like James Power, Nicholas Fagan, and John L. Lynn encouraged loyalty to the Constitution of 1924. Their plight elicited the sympathy of 10-year-old Dilyu Rose, who was then living with her parents at Stafford's Point. By the 20th of February, she recounted, the people of San Patricio and other western settlements were fleeing for their lives. Another fallacy is that only Anglo-Americans participated in the Great Runaway. Numerous accounts reveal that many Tejano families had reason to evade Santana's centralist army. John Sutherland Jr., a jackleg physician, described the mayhem in San Antonio de Bexar on February 23rd. On Tuesday, the Mexican population was in complete commotion very early in the morning. Such as had carts were loading up with their household dunnage. Those who had none were taking their effects upon their backs, and numbers had already left for the country before the cause was ascertained. All parties were completely in motion. This commotion created an inquiry into the cause of such an unusual stir. The most common reply was that they were going out to their ranches to commence preparation for the coming crops. But the great hurry and stir was so unusual that not much reliance was given to their statements. Bejareños, the citizens of San Antonio de Bexar, abandoned their homes and belongings and fled, following neighbors who had evacuated earlier. Centralist Sergeant Francisco Becerra recalled, when the army arrived, many inhabitants fled from the city, leaving everything behind them. Most of them went into the countryside. Santana must have seen them leaving too, but he made no effort to stop them. His sights were firmly set on the rebels inside the old mission. By March 13th, when Texian scout Deef Smith brought Alamo widow Susanna Dickinson into Gonzales, General Sam Houston had already learned that the fort had fallen. On March 11th, the day he and his staff had arrived in town, Bejareños Anselmo Bergera and Andreas Barcena delivered the grim intelligence. By damping down the flow of information, Houston attempted to control events, but the panic had already begun. Isolated in Gonzales, he was unaware the runaway fever had commenced in South Texas in mid-February, had already infected regions of the Anglo-American settlements as far north as the Rio Brazos. On March 6, the same day the Alamo fell, George W. Poe, Assistant Inspector General of the Army of Texas, described conditions in Velasco to the editor of the Mobile Register. I deem it my duty to my fellow citizens to inform our brethren in the United States of our perilous condition at present. There is here under my command only 120 men, when we expected at least 2,000. And it is thought the Mexican army is within a few days' march of us. Many civilians, he related, had already abandoned hope. The families at a short distance from us are flying before the enemy, and they have left their stock, their houses, and crops to the mercy of the tyrant, who is in person at the head of his army. Houston was behind the curve. Even before the news of the Alamo debacle had reached Texan settlements, some had already begun to evacuate. The 15-year-old William Physic Zuber said that all the families residing on the Colorado River had retreated east because of the belief that our garrison at the Alamo and Goliad and our few companies at Gonzales would all soon fall, and the whole country would be overrun by the Mexican soldiers. Old colonist W.B. DeWeese claimed that as soon as William B. Travis's February 24th letter arrived in Washington, men were seen hurrying away from the convention bareheaded and going they scarce knew whither. All was excitement and confusion. Reports of the Alamo carnage stunned Texans, but nowhere was the grief greater than in Gonzales. There the loss was intensely personal. There wasn't a family in the entire settlement that did not mourn the death of a friend or relative. As many as 20 women, many with small children, were now widows. Lieutenant John Sharp, one of Houston's officers, recalled the scene on the night of March 13th. For several hours after the receipt of the intelligence, not a sound was heard save the wild shrieks of the women and the heart-rending screams of the fatherless children. Their anguish also pained Johnny Jenkins. The piercing wails of woe that reached our camps from these bereaved women thrilled me and filled me with feelings I cannot express or ever forget. I now could understand that there is woe in warfare as well as glory and labor. By the way, young Jenkins had a special reason to remember the event. His stepfather had been a member of the Alamo garrison. Houston understood that he could not defend Gonzales with a motley assortment of volunteers. The answer was obvious: a hasty retreat to a more defensible position. Of course, that meant abandoning the town. My runny nose is not a part of the sciatica. That's something else. Yeah. More bad news. Grieving widows who had just lost their husbands now learned that they must also lose their homes. Orders passed from the general to the company commanders to sergeants to enlisted men. All gathered their gear and prepared to move out. Evacuating the settlement was sound military judgment. Even so, it unloaded a world of worry upon the men. All were unprepared for flight, and both time and wagons were in short supply. Captain John Bird told of 2 widows who were at supper when word came that the army was pulling out. Having no means of conveyance, he recalled, Each woman tied up a bundle of dry goods. Then each with 2 children holding on to her skirts and one carrying an infant in her arms, they departed. General Houston dumped his cannon into the Guadalupe River and gave orders to burn Gonzales. He was not, however, wholly callous. Not wishing the civilians to see their homes put to the torch, Houston led them out of town. But then he ordered no roof large enough to shelter a Mexican's head to remain. Like a shroud, despair lay upon the doomed village. Jenkins noted that the sorrow dismayed soldiers as well as civilians. A heavy gloom seemed to settle upon our men after the fall of the Alamo, and the oldest, most experienced soldiers could be found at all times, collected about camps discussing the situation of affairs. And this would have been amusing to note the widely different views of the various questions under consideration if they had not been of such vital importance to our republic and her citizens. Especially distressing were memories of Texan women who had fled, leaving all they had for years been collecting. All. Everything they had. While they themselves fled, they knew not whither. Many of them without a dollar or friend on earth. End quote. The general's efforts to spare their feelings were in vain. For that night, the dull glow on the horizon was a painful reminder of their dashed hopes and shattered dreams. It was much the same in the frontier community of Mena. Now that's modern-day Bastrop. Many residents had left in such haste that they had not packed sufficient provisions. Starvation along the roadside became a real possibility. Blacksmith Noah Smithwick retained vivid memories of the dereliction Mena residents left in their wake. This is what he said. The desolation of the country through which we passed beggars description. Houses were standing open, the beds unmade, the breakfast things still on the tables, pans of milk molding in the dairies. There were cribs full of corn, smokehouses full of bacon, yards full of chickens that ran after us for food, nests of eggs in every fence corner, young corn and garden truck rejoicing in the rain, cattle cropping the luxuriant grass, hogs, fat and lazy, wallowing in the mud, all abandoned. Forlorn dogs roamed around the deserted homes, their dreadful howls adding to the general sense of desolation. Hungry cats ran, mewing to meet us, rubbing their sides against our legs in token of welcome. The perpetual dread of Mexican and Indian attacks drove some evacuees to jettison provisions, even food. Will Zuber told how settlers did not take time for needed preparation for their journey, but hastily loaded wagons or carts with needed articles, hitched their teams, and departed. Others took what they could pack on horses, and some drove cattle before them. What they could not carry in these ways, they abandoned. Nearly all participant accounts lament the terrible spring weather. Indeed, it seemed as if Lucifer himself had orchestrated it. The rain began about mid-March, the exact time most civilians left their homes and took to the roads, and it continued until the last week of April. It might have been sufferable if folks had been snug indoors, but they weren't. They had cast themselves into the not so great outdoors, exposed to the worst downpours anyone could remember. Johnny Jenkins experienced it at its ghastliest. Exposed to the most disagreeable weather, wading by day through mud and water over the very worst of roads, and tentless at night. It was tedious and hard beyond description. Even when their operators worked day and night, the few ferries could not accommodate the large volume of traffic. Refugee Dill Rose was a little girl at the time, but even as an elderly woman, retained vivid memories of those troubled times. She especially recalled the hard rain and high water it delivered. Arrived at the San Jacinto River in the night, there were fully 5,000 people at the Lynchburg Ferry. The planters from Brazoria and Columbia, where their slaves were crossing, and we waited 3 days before we crossed. It was almost a riot to see who should cross first. We got over on the 3rd day. Yet, Dillieu remembered that the real difficulties began at the rain-dappled Trinity River, its waters turbid and turbulent. As she told it, the horrors of crossing the Trinity is beyond my power to describe. When our party got to the ferry boat, the water broke over the banks from above. We were several hours surrounded by water, and our family were the last to get to the boat, left more than 500 people on the west bank. On one occasion, a full-figured matron balked at fording an icy creek where the water was waist deep after the rest of her party had already made the crossing. One impatient leather stocking, frustrated by the delay, recrossed the creek, hoisted the hefty widow over his shoulder, and plunged in. About halfway across, the man lost his footing, and both went under. Not being able to swim, he came up sputtering for the drenched woman to save him. She did. The 15-year-old Creed Taylor enjoyed a unique perspective. He saw the spring of 1836 through the eyes of a soldier and an evacuee, which rendered his reminiscences especially valuable. Like all other runaway families, the Taylors suffered the rigors of the mizzling elements. However, few describe the horror and hardship with quite the poignancy that Creed did. His heart was near to breaking as he encountered half-clad, mud-besmeared fugitives looking like veritable savages, he said. War's saddest victims are civilians caught in the path of its devastation. The Texas Revolution was no exception. and the miserable weather only increased their suffering. Here's Creed again. There were hundreds of incidents, tragic and otherwise, occurring in the course of the wild scamper over the almost trackless and rain-soaked prairies, and in crossing swollen streams. Delicate women trudged alongside their pack horses, carts, or sleds from day to day until their shoes were literally worn out, then continued the journey with bare feet, lacerated and bleeding at almost every step. Their clothes were scant, and with no means of shelter from the frequent drenching rains and bitter winds, they traveled on through the long days in wet and bedraggled apparel, finding even at night little relief from their suffering, since the wet earth and angry sky offered no relief. At such times, neighbors and even total strangers helped when they could. S.F. Sparks recalled the courage and fortitude of our women, end quote. Floods swelled streams, and the bottomlands were from a foot to waist deep in water. At such times, Sparks said, the younger and stouter women would take the feeble ones on their backs and shoulders and wade through the water to dry land, set them down, then go back for another load and continue until all were over. Sparks exclaimed, there is no one who can do justice to the women at that time. God bless the women of Texas. In several places, the constant rain and heavy traffic had whipped the dirt roads into a morass. On one such occasion haunted Virginian visitor William Fairfax Gray. In one place, we came upon a poor ox bogged in the middle of the road. His head and a small part of his body was above the mud. His yoke had been removed, and he left there to die. A horrible death. Many families were still on the road when they learned the almost miraculous news of the San Jacinto victory. Mary Whiteman, the painfully proper Episcopalian, remarked that members of her party were so excited that they all turned shouting Methodist. She recounted that people reacted differently. Some danced, some laughed, some clapped their hands. For Mary Ann Zuber, the notification that her son William had fallen at San Jacinto deadened the thrill of victory. Her grief was such that she could not begin the trip home. The next day, another messenger arrived fresh from the battlefield. The first report had been false. William was alive and well. A relieved and euphoric mother quickly joined the celebrations. With her husband with Houston's army and her eldest son dead inside the Alamo, Fanny Sutherland had to fend for herself and 4 young children. Still, she was able to persevere because, she said, The Lord supported me and was on our side. For I may boldly say, the Lord has fought our battles. Mr. Sutherland's horse was killed under him at San Jacinto, but the Lord preserved his life and brought him back to his family. And that was true. George Sutherland finally found his wife and children among other refugees at the mouth of the Sabine River and took them home. Like many Texas women, Mrs. Sutherland returned to find much of what she had left behind had vanished. The family warehouse and one of their residences were in ashes. Even so, she accepted her losses with a strong sense of Christian grace. If we can have peace, and we can have preaching, she vowed, I won't care. I won't care for the loss of what property is gone. Now, you young people here, when adversity strikes, that's how you act. That's how Texans act. Citizens of the Lone Star State are famed for their resilience. Texas is not an easy place in which to live. Its sons and daughters have weathered hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, epidemics, rattlesnakes, mosquitoes, ticks, and even the snowpocalypse of 2021. The Runaway Scrape set the mold. Texans had certainly suffered hardships before the spring of 1836, but they had borne them as families and individuals. During the scrape, they endured as a group, as a community. Indeed, Santana had marked them for massacre because they were different, or as he called them, these damned foreigners. The hardships and heartaches they braved served as a cultural boot camp, forging unbreakable bonds, fostering a distinctive identity. Never had Texians gone to such lengths to support one another. But then, never had conditions been so desperate, nor devotion to a common cause so essential. Texians stood proudly among the world's most dyed-in-the-wool individualists. But Santana's no-quarter policy had made them all members of an endangered species. War party or peace party, wealthy planter or indigent leather-stocking, Yankee or Southerner, slave owner or abolitionist, Santana's conquest made those contentions irrelevant. To His Excellency, they were all perfidious foreigners to be slaughtered or else driven from Texas. It was ironic, really. Antonio López de Santana had unwittingly created a unity that Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and David G. Burnett had never been able to attain. They might not have sensed it before, but suddenly one's Texian identity became a matter of life and death. Nor did it matter when one arrived, an old 300 colonist or an American volunteer fresh off the boat, the Caudillo had slated both for the chopping block. Terror, defeat, and despair may have forged the new solidarity, but that did nothing to diminish its strength. The Runaway Scrape created in most Texians a bolstered sense of conjunction and a new spirit of association. In 1836, the population hovered around 30,000 Texians, 3,500 Tejanos, and 5,000 enslaved bondsmen. Yet fewer than 1,000 of them fought on April 21st. The frenzied exodus upset the lives of virtually every Texian and many Tejanos as well. Thus, as a formative experience, it had even more impact than the Battle of San Jacinto. And that experience transfigured early Texians. Soon after the war, John W. Dancy visited the fledgling republic and kept a diary of his travels. One entry recorded, "Wherever I go in this country, I hear of what is called the Runaway Scrape. It would touch the soul of anyone, not a monster, to listen to the accounts which the Texians give of the time when they were compelled to leave their homes with their little children and fly before a bloodthirsty tyrant through cold and mud and rain in hourly dread of being overtaken by the enemy." Not unlike the way the Great Depression would scar their great-grandchildren, memories of the Runaway Scrape forever branded that generation of Texians. They harbored memories of a populace in flight, driven by a common resolve. For many, it was the defining event of their lives. Serried episodes burned into their brains. Exhausted mothers suckling puling infants. Long lines of wagons, carts, and sleds. Black smoke billowing up above blazing towns. Cries of frantic parents calling missing children. The sucking sound that the ox hooves made as they plodded through deep sludge. And into the distance, mounted on a white stallion, a mere detail amid the madness, yet somehow towering above it all. The figure of a man wearing a scruffy dress coat, more often than not bareheaded, revealing his thinning hairline, unreadable, doffing his hat in acknowledgments to the ranks of wearied rebels marching to indefinite destinations. For as long as they remained above the sod, runaways regaled their children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors with stories of the privations they endured, the disasters they witnessed, the tragedies and triumphs they faced. They believed their stories worthy of remembrance. What ingrate would say them wrong? Thank you very much for your attention.